to myself as well as the company that I represent. So my name is Anil Murty, and I'm the head of product at Overclock Labs. In terms of my background, I've spent probably half of my career as an engineer and the remaining half as a product leader. And so I have a natural passion for building products that make engineers' lives easier on a day-to-day basis. Overclock Labs is the company that I represent, and it was founded in 2016 by Greg and Adam. Overclock Labs is the creator and still the core contributor to Akash Network. And so Overclock Labs got started with the idea of trying to monetize unused capacity in various data centers around the world. And then in the last few years, we really found our product market fit in the Web3 communities. And so now our whole mission in life is to make sure that we build the open cloud for everybody in Web3. So that's a little bit about us. I would love to know a little bit about you all. So if you wouldn't mind indulging me in a quick poll, who here is a technical person? Awesome. So that's about 30%, I'd say, of the audience. Great to have you here. Who here is familiar with Akash? So you've heard of us, read about us, anything of that sort? Wow, a little more than half of the audience. That's awesome. Love you guys. And then who here has used us, meaning you've deployed on us, done something of that sort? Sweet. That's like still 30, 40%. Very, very cool. Awesome. So the good news is, if you raised your hand for any of those questions, you're going to get a lot out of this presentation. But if you didn't raise your hand, you're also going to get a lot. So in terms of an outline, the very first part of my presentation is basically going to be not about Akash, but just about the state of Web3 infrastructure today. After that, I'm going to do a quick introduction to what Akash is for the people that are not familiar with us. And then I'm going to jump a little bit into the weeds and talk about how it's built underneath. And that's probably the most technical part of my presentation. And then following that, I'm going to do a demo of a product that we've never shown anybody outside of our company so far. And this is what we're calling Overclock Console. So for the first time, we're going to show you Overclock Console. And then to wrap things up, it wouldn't be right if I didn't talk about our awesome ecosystem. So I'm going to talk about our community and our ecosystem a little bit, and then I'll open it up to questions. So let's get going. So state of Web3 infrastructure. There's a lot we can talk about when we talk about the state of Web3 infrastructure. But to not boil the ocean, I'm going to boil it down to three things. First, I'm going to talk about the state of Web3 infrastructure from a decentralization perspective, and specifically about where is the infrastructure being hosted today. Next, I'm going to talk about the cost of hosting your infrastructure and how that impacts decentralization. And then I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the developer traction within Web3 and how that's impacted by the choice of infrastructure. So let's start with talking about the hosting infrastructure. And what better way to do that than to talk about the two arguably biggest projects where people build decentralized applications on today. So on the left of the slide is a screenshot from a website called ethernodes.org. And it's basically showing us a breakdown of where the various nodes that are doing all the work on Ethereum's chains are located. And so what's easy to see from this slide is that a little more than 50% of all the nodes running on Ethereum today are running on Amazon's infrastructure within AWS. What's also easy to see is like 3/4 of all of the nodes today are running on three big cloud providers. So you got AWS, you got Ethna Cloud, and then you got Google Cloud, right? I went looking for similar stats for Solana, but I couldn't find a chart that looked this clean. But what I did find is a large number of articles that talk about how more than a third of the infrastructure that Solana nodes run on is all AWS as well, right? So it's easy to see where I'm going with all of this. Number one, if this is the state of infrastructure for these two big chains, it very likely is similar for the rest of the chains as well. Number two, these chains are really dependent on these big clouds, right? So what that means is that tomorrow, if AWS decides that they want nothing to do with crypto, we have a little bit of a problem going on, not just for the chains, but also the applications that are running on top of them. And if you think that I'm overblowing this concern a little bit, think again. Because 3 weeks ago, that's exactly what Etzner Cloud in Germany decided to do. And keep in mind, the previous slide, Etzner is the second largest hosting provider for Ethereum today. So Etzner went out and said, we want nothing to do with crypto. If you're a crypto person, think about getting off of us, right? And when this news article broke, within a few hours, Akash was actually trending on Twitter. And so there was over 7,000 tweets mentioning Akash on that same day. And this is really awesome because it means that the word is getting out about the decentralized cloud. So some of you who are technical and who have sort of been in the world of infrastructure for a while are probably looking at that and saying, big deal. If that happens, we can always move to a different data center provider, right? In theory, that would be right. But in practice, it's a little different. So the chart on the right, because your eyes are probably going to go there, is the number of data centers over time in the world, right? So back in 2015, we had little over 8.5 million data centers across the world. And today, that number is a little over 7 million, right? So if you think about what's causing the number of data centers to go down over time, there could be a lot of reasons for it. But I speculate that one of the biggest reasons is because it's hard to be a data center provider today. If you look at if you sort of think about what it would take for you to spin up your application or your services on a data center instead of somebody like AWS, you're basically competing with a service that is self-service, has zero CapEx spent from you, and can be spun up without talking to anybody. So it's completely self-service and no high touch. If you try to do the same thing with a data center, you're looking at 3 to 6 months of work, interacting with a lot of people manually, and it's just a very elaborate process. And so if you were to be in a situation where you couldn't host on AWS, you'd have a long time before you'd be up and running again. Now, the flip side of this is, even though the number of data centers have declined, there still are 7.2 million data centers in the world today. Another statistic, which is not on the slide, is out of these 7.2 million data centers, on average, only about 15% of their compute capacity and their data center capacity typically gets utilized to the fullest on a day-to-day basis. So what that means is that there's about 80 to 85% of capacity within these data centers that is unutilized or is underutilized, right? So anything we can do to sort of make that utilized and make it monetizable is a good thing. OK, so assuming that you still want to keep running in these large public clouds, let's talk a little bit about what the cost of doing that is, right? So one of the biggest misconceptions that people have about public clouds today is that it's cheaper to run in public cloud than it is to run in a data center. And while that is right when you're starting out, if you're a startup, it's really easy to get started on AWS. You have a lot of flexibility. You don't spend any money on capital expenditure. All that is true. There is this huge paradox as you get really large, right? And don't just take my word for it. Take A16Z's word for it. So here's an article that the good folks at A16Z wrote more than a year ago. And they call it the $1 trillion paradox. The reason they call it the $1 trillion paradox is because they looked at the revenue structure and the cost structure of these really big, large SaaS public companies today. And there's a few examples here. And what they found is that, on average, more than 50% of the revenue that these companies generate is ending up as expense that they spend on these public clouds, right? So to put this in perspective, think about the situation where you use a given app on your phone, like Uber, like DoorDash, to order your food, to get a car. Every time you give $1 to this company, like Uber or DoorDash, they're turning around and giving 50 cents out of that dollar to AWS, right? Just think about that for a second. So all this is to say that there is a really large opportunity sitting somewhere between the infrastructure and the applications that run on top of them, right? And that's kind of where we're going with our company and our ecosystem. Here's another data point for you, and it comes from our friends over at Cloudflare. And they specifically focus on what's called egress cost. And so if you're not familiar with what egress cost is, it's basically the cost that you incur when you try to pull data out of AWS. So let's say you have an application running on AWS today. You're serving thousands, if not millions of users. And tomorrow, you're in a situation where you've got to move this application to something else. You'd have to pay AWS to actually pull that data out. And the reason this is really egregious, they think it's egregious, is because AWS charges you not for the pipe that you're connecting to AWS with, but rather the amount of water that's coming out of that pipe into a bucket. Contrast this to your internet connection at home. You pay for the size of the pipe you get. So you pay in terms of the download and upload speeds, right? You don't pay in terms of the amount of data you consume per month. AWS is charging you based on the amount of data you'll consume. What's even crazier is that when they get this service from their service provider, they pay for the pipe. So they're not passing that on to you. OK, so assuming you're convinced about the egregious costs of public cloud, you're probably thinking, but this isn't going to affect me as a Web3, little tiny Web3 app developer. It's only affecting really large, big Web2 companies, right? Think again, because essentially, if you sort of connect the dots here, the lower the cost of the infrastructure, the more people can spin up things like validators, and the less centralized the chains become. And so there's a direct correlation between infrastructure cost and decentralization. OK, so switching gears now and talking about the third thing in the state of Web3, let's talk about traction in Web3, developer traction specifically. So here's a chart that's comparing and contrasting the growth of Web3 developers on the left with the growth of developers in the world as a whole, so both Web2 and Web3. What's very clear, right, when you look at these charts is the chart on the left is pretty much a hockey stick, right? So it's exponential growth, which is crazy awesome that there's so much growth happening in the developer ecosystem in Web3. But if you actually look at the absolute numbers, the number on the left is 18,400, and it's a tiny fraction of the number on the right, which is almost 30 million, right? So the question I'd ask is, what can we be doing to make sure that there's more people moving from the one on the right to the one on the left? And while there's a lot we can do, I specifically want to focus, being a product person, I specifically want to focus on something I call the developer product ecosystem. So this is a chart from our friends over at Coinbase. And they've done a really good job of defining what they call a Web3 developer stack. And so it's sort of partitioning all the ecosystem players in the developer ecosystem for Web3 in these different layers. And you can see right there, if I can use this, somewhere out there is Akash in the decentralized cloud area. And then you can see Messari is in the analytics area. So they've done their due diligence. We can trust this chart. So this is pretty healthy, right? It's a healthy ecosystem that's growing. But to keep ourselves honest, let's compare and contrast this to how things look in the traditional Web2 world. So here is a chart from the CNCF. For those that are not familiar with it, it's the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. These guys are arguably the biggest open source body that's out there. They're part of the Linux Foundation, and they basically foster tools and products for cloud native applications and developers and tools, right? So you can clearly see that the Web3 ecosystem, as healthy as it is now, is a tiny fraction of this. If that wasn't crazy enough, keep in mind that there's a whole bunch of commercial products that are not even on this slide. That's probably 2 or 3 times this. So anything we can do to sort of get more developers into Web3 is a good thing. So to summarize what I've said so far, number one, there is a big concentration of Web3 infrastructure on big clouds. And that is a risk, not just to the infrastructure and the chains, but also the applications running on them. The cost of public clouds, if you choose to still run on them, is going to be prohibitive as you start to scale. And so anything we can do to reduce or offer competition to that is a good thing. And then third, anything we can do to improve the tooling and the product ecosystem for developers is going to incentivize more developers from the Web 2 world to move into Web 3, and that's ultimately going to result in better decentralized applications getting built. So now I want to talk about how Akash Network and its ecosystem is reimagining the cloud and solving some of those problems. So let's start with a quick, super high-level overview of, or refresher of how existing public clouds work today. So in an existing public cloud infrastructure, what you have is a single large entity that owns all the infrastructure, and then you have thousands, if not millions, of users connecting to that one infrastructure provider. The problem with this type of situation is, number one, because they control all the infrastructure, they get to decide what the cost is going to be, and you've got to accept it. Number two, they get to decide where this infrastructure is going to reside in the world. So if AWS chooses to have only one data center in your country, that is the one you've got to connect to. Number three, the user experience is what they build. You've got to work with that. So there's not a lot of choice in terms of the user experience as well as the providers. So let's think about how this can be improved with the concept of decentralization. So the simplest thing you can do is you can take, instead of having a single entity own all the infrastructure, think about a situation where there are many, many, many entities owning little pieces of infrastructure, and you're not reliant on that one single entity. And then you also have a large amount of choice, as well as competition in terms of pricing that you get, right? So it sounds great in theory. The problem with this situation is that if you're a user or a developer, you've got to now figure out how to deploy on provider A, how to deploy on provider number 2, number 3, number 4. Each of these is going to have a different type of contract you've got to negotiate. Each of these is going to have a different length of the contract. Each of these is going to have a different user experience for deploying your applications. And so you'd need an army of DevOps people to manage your applications, right? And so this is where Akash saw the opportunity and decided to build something. So the Akash marketplace for cloud compute it's essentially a software abstraction layer that sits in between these providers and the users. And so it's sort of an abstraction on top of the providers that makes it extremely easy to deploy your applications on all of these providers. So you get a consistent experience of deploying, and we make the process of negotiating leases extremely easy. And we're leveraging a blockchain to do this, not because blockchains are cool. I mean, they are cool, but because there actually is a core value proposition to using blockchains here, which is really clear. And the value proposition is, if you're going to be negotiating leases with lots of people, you want that out to be in the open, and you want it to be sort of permissionless, right? And so with the use of blockchains, we're able to have people associate themselves with blockchain addresses, and then each time a lease is created, it's stored on the blockchain. And so the Akash Network blockchain is powered by the AKT token, and that's what enables all of this. So to recap sort of the benefits of doing this, number one is obviously cost. So on the right there is a screenshot from one of our ecosystem providers, or one of our ecosystem partners. It's a team called CloudMoss, and they basically built this really cool pricing tool. So you can literally go to that link, plug in the kind of resources you want, and you can do a comparison of what it's going to cost you to deploy on Akash versus deploying on AWS, GCP, Azure. And you can see that in many cases, the cost of deploying on Akash is up to 80% lower than some of these other providers. Outside of cost, you've got a greater amount of choice, because there's a large number of providers, each with different attributes in terms of locations, in terms of the kinds of services they can offer you, the reliability, the price, et cetera. It's self-sovereign, it's open source, it's community-driven, and it's powered by blockchain. So if all of that has you at least a little bit excited, let me talk a little bit about how all this works underneath. So number one, in terms of talking about under the hood things, everything that's built on Akash is open source. So you can literally go to Overclock Labs' open source GitHub repository, and all the code that makes Akash Network run and that whole abstraction layer is out there. The two technologies that we rely on the most are Kubernetes and Docker, both open source projects, both massively adopted in the world. And so all the providers, and we'll talk about what providers are, they run Kubernetes clusters. And then all the tenants, who are, we refer to them as users, as I mentioned, they deploy Docker containers onto those Kubernetes clusters. So let's dig one level deeper and talk about a typical deployment workflow on Akash. So looking from the left here and to the right, you as a user start off on the left. And what you do is you take your application and you containerize it. So you turn it into a Docker container so that it is composable, it is immutable, and you can move it anywhere. Then you feed that into something called an SDL file. SDL stands for Stack Definition Language. And as the name suggests, it is the way for you to define what your infrastructure stack should be for your application. So this includes things like compute, locations, other attributes, pricing that you want to pay, all of that. So you take this SDL file, and you submit it to the Akash marketplace. And this process of submitting your SDL file is what we refer to as requesting a bid from the providers. And so once you do that, what the Akash marketplace does is it turns around, takes your SDL file, and broadcasts it out to all the providers that are part of the Akash marketplace. And as of today, there's a little bit over 50 providers, 50 providers on the Akash marketplace. And our ambitions is to take that to 1,000 providers over time. So it turns around, sends it to all these providers. Each of these providers look at the SDL file, and they decide, is this something that I can satisfy? Right? Is this something that I can host? And they come back with bids to you. And so you get a whole bunch of bids back, and you choose the bid that works best for you. Maybe you care about price, and you're willing to give up a little performance. Or maybe it's a super high real-time application that you're willing to pay a lot of money for. You choose a provider that's expensive. That's fine. It's your choice. Once you decide what the provider is going to be, like in this case, we choose provider 2 that sent you bid number 2. You go ahead and tell Akash to deploy on it, and a few minutes later, your app is running on that provider. So it's a really straightforward process. 4 steps. Build your SDL file with your image, request bids, choose a provider, deploy. That's it. So some of you who are technical have probably picked up that the thing that is very Akash specific here is the SDL file. So here is an example of an SDL file. What this SDL file is trying to do is deploy a Tetris game on the web, right? If you have done Docker or written a Docker compose file, you should feel completely at home right now. But for the rest of us, what I'm going to do is break down this file and explain what's going on here. So there's basically 5 questions that this file is answering. The first one is, what app or service are you trying to deploy? So you can see right there that this is pulling an image from a public GitHub or Docker repository for the Tetris game. And then it's trying to expose port 80, which is basically the port for HTTP. So this is going to be something that's going to be running on the web. The next set of things is, what infrastructure and resources do you want? So how much memory, CPU, and storage. After that is, where do you want to run this? And you get to decide things like which geographical location, what provider. If you have a favorite provider, you can specify that here. After that is the most important, which is, how much do you want to pay for this? And you get to actually ask that, unlike AWS. And then last, but not the least, is, do you want this to be replicated so that it's fault tolerant and all of that? So that's it. It's a simple, straightforward thing. But I've been in the industry long enough and done infrastructure products long enough to know that there's going to be at least a few, and I see a few people smiling there, that absolutely hate YAML, right? And you cannot convince them that YAML is a good thing. So for all those people and others as well, we have built an amazing product that we're calling Overclock Console. And so now what I'm going to do is, I was going to show a live demo, but the good folks at Messari advised me well that I should not rely on an internet connection. And so we're going to actually show a pre-recorded version that I recorded last night in my hotel room. And we're going to show that right now. So if you could please roll to the first video. So while that video queues up, so what you're looking at is basically, we're going to show a video of deploying that exact Tetris game. So if you could pause there for a second. So this is console, right? It's a completely web-based application. So there's no need to download any sort of binaries. There's no need to install any sort of things on your local machine, none of that. The other thing to notice about it is that there's no user login anywhere here. There's no, you don't see my face anywhere, nothing of that. So it's completely non-custodial. If you go to the web once we have this out there and click on it, you'll see exactly this page without having to log in. The other thing about it is that you connect to it and use it using your wallet. So it's a Kepler wallet today. This is built on Cosmos. We built our Akash network on Cosmos's network. So you connect to it using a Kepler wallet, and that's sort of your identity within the application. The next thing to note here is it's a really clean UI. There's no overwhelming amount of menus. There's just a few templates here. And so each of these templates is a predefined configuration for this application that you want to deploy, right? And so you've got fun and games for people that have no clear mission in mind and just playing around with the application. You get started with that. And then the rest of these templates here are sort of going back to that mission I talked about before, which is the more validators we can get onto these chains, the more decentralized these chains are. And so our mission in life for the next several months is going to be to make it really easy to deploy validators on Cosmos's chains first, and then eventually on any blockchain out there. So we're going to basically make this absolutely easy as possible. Just click, 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 got a validator running. If you can go ahead and start the video again. So now you can see that there's similar templates for all the Cosmos chains. And if you were in the Cosmos talk, or if you're already familiar with the Cosmos ecosystem, this should make complete sense. So what I'm going to do now is show it in demo of deploying that Tetris game that I showed you the SDL for. So here I am. I'm selecting Tetris as one of the games. I'm hitting deploy now. And so you can see that it's so easy. All you've got to do is specify the name of the application, and then go ahead and deploy. That's it. If you don't care about all the technical details, that's all you got to do. If you do care about tweaking things a little bit, you can go there and say, you know, I don't want one CPU, I want two CPUs. I want to increase the amount of memory, change the storage, that sort of thing. Now, if you're even more technical and you want to get really, really deep, you can actually go look at that SDL file. That's an option. So we're going to go ahead and click deploy. What's going to happen now is that Kepler wallet popped up. And so this very fact of requesting bids, that itself is a blockchain transaction. So it's stored on the blockchain, visible to anyone. So we're getting bids from these providers now. And so this is where Akash has sent it off and gotten bids. So now you have bids from all of these different providers. Each of them is indicating what the price is going to be. You can click on more info and understand a little more about the provider. Next step, you choose a provider, accept the lease. It goes ahead and creates the lease for you. So it's creating that lease now. And so what's happening now is it's negotiating with that provider, getting the lease, and it's deploying your app. That's it. Your app is deployed. You can go ahead and click on that link. That's the HTTP endpoint for that app. And there we go. We've got Tetris running. So it's as simple as that, right? That's how long it takes to deploy an app on Akash Network. The next thing I'm going to do is show something a little more complicated. So if you can roll to the second video and pause there for a second. So now we saw a simple Tetris application being deployed. But our mission in life for the next several months, again, is to get as many validators as possible, right? So I'm going to show you a demonstration of deploying what's called an Rpc node onto the Akash blockchain. So the Rpc node, if you're not familiar with it, is one of three types of nodes within the Cosmos ecosystem. A typical Cosmos chain is going to have something called a validator node. So this is the node that's actually validating and creating new transactions on the Cosmos blockchains. And then you're going to have these two other types of nodes. One of the nodes is what they refer to as an Rpc node. This is a node that you typically spin up to inspect things on the blockchain. So you can look at what transactions are going through, who are the peers, et cetera. And then a third type of node is what we refer to as a Sentry node, right? A Sentry node, as the name suggests, is basically designed to protect the validator nodes. So a typical validator node will have 3 or 4 Sentry nodes, and they're primarily going to be protecting it from getting DDoSed. So if you can roll forward with the video, what you'll see next is those 3 types of nodes. So we've got all 3 templates. I'm going to pick Rpc node, click deploy, like I did with the Tetris app, give it a name, and just go ahead and view the SDL file, view the various configuration options, and then hit deploy, just like I did with the Tetris. So no difference at all. Doesn't matter if it's a Tetris file. Doesn't matter if it's a RPC node or a validator node. Click deploy, sending the bids now. It's going to create, again, a blockchain transaction. Accept that. Less than a penny to do that. Creating the deployment now. So hopefully we'll get back some bids on this. So this is now all the providers receiving the SDL file, processing it, deciding if it's something they can support. And notice that we'll send you a few providers first, and we'll keep working. We'll keep working, right? So as we get even more providers, we'll show those to you as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that provider, hit submit deployment, another blockchain transaction to record that. Now we're recording the fact that we've negotiated a lease with this particular provider. And in a few minutes, we should have a lease. And now we send the manifest, app is deployed again. Except this time, instead of being a simple game, it's an actual RPC node that is running on the Akash blockchain. So what you're seeing here now is all the events, and you'll see this for every single application. So this is literally all the events where your container is being pulled down, your container is being spun up, the pods are being instantiated, all of that. If you're familiar with Kubernetes and Docker, that'll make sense. So now here is the logs. So what's happening now is it's actually pulling down a really large file. And this is basically a snapshot of the entire chain, of the entire Akash chain. And so this is going to take a while. So you can see it's like at 1%, 2%. It's like several gigabytes of data that it's pulling down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump ahead and show you another RPC node that I deployed previously and show you sort of how that looks when it's deployed. So here I am on the My Deployment screen. So this is all the deployments I've done. And here is the spun up RPC node. And you can see in the logs that it's now looking at all the blockchain transactions. And then the endpoint that it's going to create is going to be a HTTP endpoint that's going to show you all the RPC endpoints for Akash. So I can click on one of these, and I can see like the various JSON objects associated with the things that are happening on the Akash blockchain. So you can see like it's got peers, it's got all the chain data, essentially. So it's so easy to spin up an RPC node on Akash. And same thing for pretty much any of the Cosmos blockchains today. And in the future, Ethereum, Solana, whatever. So that's the demo. Overclock console is not publicly available today. But in the next couple of weeks or so, we're going to go through a quick beta program. So if you're interested in signing up for the beta program, talk to one of us. There's a bunch of us with white T-shirts that have a cloud on it. So it's an Akash cloud. Talk to me, talk to any of us, and see if you want to get onto that beta program. But we'll be opening it up for general availability pretty soon as well. All right, next slide, please. Oh, sorry. My bad. The clicker isn't working. I think you gotta like click onto that or something. So the last thing I wanted to do while they're getting this sorted out was to talk about the Akash ecosystem, because it wouldn't be right for me to just talk about Overclock console and Akash, because the ecosystem is a huge part of what we build. So we have a really growing and thriving ecosystem in Akash, right? And there's people that are obviously integrating with us and running their infrastructure on Akash today, and that's all the logos on the right side, and there's more. I just picked a few here. But then there's also people building on top of us. So much like you've got various companies building on top of AWS, you've got people starting to build on top of Akash, right? So to feature some of these, number one, on the left side here, is a little small team called Praetor. And what they're building, the Praetor app, is basically a super easy way to spin up a provider on Akash. So today, if you want to become a provider on Akash, definitely hit up them. Check out their UI. They've got a really slick UI for setting up a provider and starting to make money, essentially, when people deploy on you. The next three are app deployment solutions, similar to console, except they're going after very different verticals compared to what console is going to be. So console's entire mission, at least for the next year or so, is going to be on validators and chains. Some of these solutions here are doing things like making it easy for you to use fiat as opposed to AKT to deploy. Some of these solutions are working on Web 2, like Web 2 applications on Akash. And then the last one down there is Murty audits. And they're playing a really pivotal role in auditing all of these providers. So when you're deploying on Akash, you can rest assured that many of the providers are going to be audited by a third-party person to confirm things like, is this an actual real provider or is it a scam? Is this provider claiming, if the provider claims to have a certain amount of compute capacity, do they really have that? They'll test out if an application can be deployed on that provider before they allow it on the Akash marketplace. So that's all the good work that Murty is doing. So that's the ecosystem. The last thing I want to do is talk about how you can, if all of this is exciting to you, how you can engage with us. So if you want to engage with us, there's a bunch of ways you can do that. Number one, obviously, you can join our Discord. There's a link down there, or ask any of us to send you an invite. You can join our Discord, participate on it, listen in. You can choose to deploy your app on Akash. So if you have a personal website today, Akash literally, like our customers, if you want to call them that, range anywhere from the Department of Defense. So literally, the Department of Defense has a website running on Akash today, all the way down to DeFi projects, and all the way down to people's own personal websites. Like many of us run our own blogs and stuff on that, right? So you can do that. You can choose to become a provider. So if you're looking to actually monetize and participate in Web3, this is one way to do it. Become an Akash provider, use Praetor app to spin up your provider. You can choose to build on top of Akash. So many of the people I showed on the previous slide, they're actually technically startups that are building on top of Akash today. So if you have a startup idea based on what you've heard, talk to us, engage with us. We have an awesome biz dev team that spends a fair amount of time with our partners in our ecosystem. Engage with us on that. And then last but not the least, if you already have a Web3 solution somewhere, it doesn't matter if it's on Cosmos, on Solana, on Ethereum, wherever, talk to us if you think there's something we can do in terms of an integration or even just from a partnership perspective. So that's just a little few ways to engage with us. The last thing I'll leave out there is my own Twitter handle. So if you have any questions or want to just follow up with me later, you can hit me up on that as well. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions. And I'm going to pick up my headset so I can hear you.
You can raise your hand if you have a question. We'll bring over a mic.
Hey. Somebody have a question?
Yeah, I have a question related to the supply side. So how does Overclock Labs plan on scaling the number of providers? Right now it's around 50, and I know you guys, you just said you plan on trying to get that to 1,000. Is there a specific strategy there, or is the plan just like as the demand side grows, so should the supply side?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like any two-sided marketplace, the challenge always is how do you bootstrap it, right? And there's two sides of it. In our case, I would argue there's three sides: tenants, providers, and auditor, right? So we're always focused on trying to do a little bit of both, right? So initially, when we were bootstrapping this, we spun up a few providers and had them out there. And then eventually, word of mouth started to spread. People started to get interested in this and started spinning up their own providers. So to answer your question specifically, there's kind of 3 or 4 things, and there's lots we can do, but there's 3 or 4 things. Number one is make it really easy to spin up a provider, right? And that's what folks like Praetor are doing by making that really easy. The second thing is showing clear ways that you can get profitability from being a provider. And there's people that are building tools for that. We're going to be looking potentially at doing that as well. So making it really clear as to how you can sort of become profitable is the next thing. The third thing is going to be things like us creating incentives for people to become providers. And so we're going to be looking at strategies around incentivizing providers, as well as maybe creating pools of providers, lots of ideas around there. So definitely connect with us. We can talk a lot more about things from a marketing perspective as well as from a biz dev perspective. Great question. Thank you.
Hi, I just have a question about when you posted for bid for the application, how often does that return, like there was some that returned immediately, is it guaranteed that you will get an acceptance, or is it you kind of have to kind of play with it until you get some that return?
Yeah, another amazing question. Like I love the level of detail that you have in your question. So the question, just to repeat if people didn't get it, was are we guaranteed to get a bid back when we submit one, right? So a lot of it depends exactly on what you're asking for. So like, if you get really granular, it's sort of like a filter. Think of it as a filter, right? You're in a web application, and if you give it a whole bunch of filters, you're going to get less results, right? So if you keep it pretty generic and say, any provider give me stuff, you'll get stuff back. If you be very specific and say, I only want a provider audited by so-and-so, it needs to have this amount of compute capacity, it needs to be this really low price, then you'll get fewer bids. So it's literally entirely tweakable by you. Other questions?
Anil, I actually have a quick one.
Yeah,
What's
go for it.
of the 50 or so providers so far, what's turnover been? Are they sticky? People come and stay?
I think it's been pretty sticky, but I don't have like solid numbers. Definitely talk to us, or some of our BD folks are out here. It's been pretty sticky. Like at least in the time that I've been in Overclock Labs, I've not seen. I keep seeing the same providers bid on the things that I'm trying to deploy. So I think it's been pretty sticky.
All right, if we have no more, thank you very much. We'll be back after lunch at around 2 o'clock.
Thanks, everyone.